Here's a question. What would it take for you to compromise something you claim to believe in? Not in a huge way. Just, bend it a little for the right price. We all like to think we'd stand firm, that our values are not for sale. But then we watch people we respect, people who've built entire careers on speaking truth to power, accept money from a regime that silences critics. And suddenly, that question gets a little uncomfortable, which is exactly what's just happened and why we're talking about it on this channel. Because Aziz Ansari and some of the biggest comedians in the world just performed at Saudi Arabia's Riyadh comedy festival for massive paydays. Then Ansari went on Jimmy Kimmel to explain why.
I was just there to do a show for the people, and to me, like a comedy festival felt like something that's pushing things to be more open and to push a dialogue. And you kind of have to make a choice of whether you're going to isolate or engage. It's a complicated issue.
Now for me, this is philosophy in action. Someone gives you an argument and you actually examine it. You ask, is it any good? Does it hold up? Or is this just a self-serving rationalization? And I'm going to assume that those are his genuine reasons, not something a PR team cooked up after the fact. Use the principle of charity. We'll give them a fair hearing. Because here's what makes all of this really interesting for me. A lot of comedians were offered that gig, and a lot of them said no. They turned down the money. So were they naive? Or were they grandstanding? Or were they right? Tell me in the comments where you land on this, but what we're going to do is we're going to find out by applying basic philosophical reasoning to the three arguments Ansari gives, testing out whether these justifications are sound or whether they crumble under scrutiny. And I think it matters, not as gossip, but because this is an example of how we all have to make compromises, how little by little we do it, sometimes with good reasons that maybe in the long term don't quite hold up. And then somewhere along the way, we realize something really important. They aren't our values if we don't live them. The Riyadh Comedy Festival isn't just a gig. It's a part of Saudi Vision 2030, a massive PR campaign designed to make the world forget about a murdered journalist, imprisoned activists, and a rate of executions that is one of the highest on earth. But let's just stick to the comedy and free speech alone. Because even on that score, the Saudi government's not known for their sense of humour. The festival coincided with the 7th anniversary of journalist Jamal Khashoggi's brutal murder by Saudi government operatives, and it came months after Saudi authorities executed Turki al-Yasser, a writer and a journalist who made jokes about corruption in the Saudi royal family. Abdulaziz al-Zayani, creator of the satirical show Massamia County, which is kind of like a South Park meets Family Guy that became hugely popular on Netflix, check it out, was sentenced to 13 years in jail and an alleged 30-year travel ban for, quote, terrorism and promoting homosexuality. Fahad al-Butayeri, known as Saudi Arabia's Jerry Seinfeld, was allegedly handcuffed, blindfolded, and forced onto a plane to Saudi Arabia when he was performing in Jordan. And in 2018, Saudi Arabia introduced a law to punish anyone who produces satire online deemed to be, quote, mocking public order with jail sentences and fines. This is the regime paying for a comedy festival, and many fellow comedians were happy to attend. And yet, here's what the Saudi government clearly understands. They don't need you to approve of these things. They just need you to stop thinking about them. If they can get your favourite comedians to show up, tell jokes, post photos with fans, then suddenly Saudi Arabia becomes just another tour stop. Not a place where dissidents disappear, just somewhere Kevin Hart performed last month. That's what they're buying. Not entertainment, but normalisation. And here's what that costs. Every time we participate in systems like this, even as an audience, even as fans, we're making a choice about whose dignity counts. The comedian on stage or an activist in a cell. The person getting paid or the person who can't speak. And Albert Camus understood all of this. He wrote that human dignity isn't individual, it's collective. When we accept the violation of one person's dignity, we diminish everyone's, including our own. Not because we're bad people, but because dignity is indivisible. And that's the trade. Laughter for legitimacy. And I'd argue that everyone who shows up is a party to that. But why comedy? Saudi Arabia has already done sports washing. It's already had Formula One, golf, football. They've hosted concerts. They've funded films. They've opened museums. Even bought my favourite art form, opera. But I'd argue that comedy is quite different. Because you can watch a race without endorsing anything. You can listen to music passively. But comedy requires something from you. It requires a laugh. And a laugh is kind of a form of agreement. When you laugh, you're saying, I'm with you on that one. You're participating. And that's why the lineup matters. These aren't just famous people. They're progressive voices, comedians who've built entire careers on speaking truth to power, on defending the vulnerable, and on calling out hypocrisy. I'd argue they're not just authorities on dick jokes, they're moral authorities too, whether they acknowledge it or not. So when Aziz Ansari or Bill Burr or Kevin Hart show up in Riyadh, they're not just performing, they're vouching. They're saying with their presence, this is fine, this is normal, you can laugh here. And that permission is expensive. Reports suggest headliners earn between $500,000 and well over $1 million US for a single show. For context, a typical arena performance might pay them about $100,000 to $200,000. So this isn't comedy money, it's we need your credibility money, which means the justifications for taking it need to be extraordinarily good. So let's examine what they are. And I know I'm picking on Ansari a little bit, but I've read a few justifications from comedians now, like from Louis C.K. and Omid Yalili, and they all make a series of the same argumentative moves. Often the first justification goes like this. Premise 1 is Saudi Arabia is making social progress. Premise 2 is Western engagement encourages that progress. And the conclusion is, therefore, performing in Saudi Arabia supports positive change. It sounds reasonable. It sounds hopeful. So let's test it. Because first, is Saudi Arabia changing? Well, yes, in some ways. Women can drive now. Cinemas are open. Some social restrictions have loosened. But those reforms came with a little bit of a caveat. Political repression has actually intensified. More activists have been imprisoned. Dissent, I'd argue, is being crushed more efficiently. And the message from the Saudi government is pretty clear. You can have social liberalization, but only if you don't ask for political freedom. This is a common authoritarian bargain. Vladimir Putin, for example, promised Russians private wealth and economic prosperity in exchange for accepting a managed democracy. And I'd ask, like Dr. Phil, how's that working for you? China offers the same deal. But here's what history teaches us. When that promised freedom becomes inconvenient, the authoritarian state often breaks the deal. And then we end up with neither. There's no bargaining with a power that sees itself as absolute. So the changes aren't necessarily reforms. Actually, they're concessions. And concessions can be revoked without permission. Second, we should ask, does Western engagement actually encourage reform? And here's the problem. This argument assumes that the performers have leverage, that their presence creates pressure for change. But they don't have leverage. They have a contract. They show up, they perform, they get paid, and then they leave. The regime controls the narrative the entire time, and we've already seen this in action around this very festival. And historically, this also doesn't work. For example, South Africa didn't end apartheid because musicians performed in Sun City. Change came from boycotts, from divestment, and from international isolation, and most importantly, from South Africans who risked everything to demand their freedom. So engagement without consequence doesn't produce reform. It produces cover. And what actually drives change? It's cost. When maintaining the status quo becomes more expensive than changing it politically or economically or diplomatically, that's when regimes move. A comedy festival, it does the opposite. It reduces the cost by making the regime look normal, acceptable, and business as usual. Just organizations we have to deal with because that's the world we live in, which is a pretty depressing view of things, in my opinion. And I think this is also where Camus again becomes relevant. His rebel does not negotiate with oppression or try to improve it from within. The rebel refuses, because the refusal itself is the statement. It's saying that some things cannot be compromised, that human dignity isn't subject to incremental progress reports, and it can't be bargained away particularly by comedians whose only real power is their ability to tell the truth and to have other people hear it. And in doing so, they allow us to laugh at the difference between the story we're being told and the actual truth. The reformers in Saudi Arabia, the ones that are actually risking their freedom, they aren't asking for celebrity visits. They're asking for solidarity. And solidarity means refusing to provide cover and not showing up to provide entertainment. But that's not the only argument that these comedians provide. The second justification goes something like this. Premise 1 is boycotts don't help locals, and premise 2 asserts exposure does, which leads to the conclusion, therefore, engagement is the ethical path. It sounds pragmatic, it sounds compassionate, but there are 3 problems here. First, it's a false dilemma. This argument assumes that you either perform or you do nothing. But there's an entire range of actions in between. They could amplify Saudi activists. They could use their platform to spotlight abuses. They could organise genuine solidarity campaigns. Or they could donate their fee to human rights organisations, which, incidentally, some of the performers have done a little sheepishly and a little after the fact and when their participation got noticed. The choice isn't engage or abandon. That framing is designed to make engagement seem like the only moral option. But it isn't. And here's where the argument doesn't just fail, it collapses entirely. Because implicit in this engagement justification is the idea that comedians could use the stage to challenge power, to speak uncomfortable truths, to create genuine dialogue. Except they couldn't. Their contracts explicitly forbade discussing the Saudi government, or the royal family, or any aspect of religion. Human rights abuses were off limits. Jamal Khashoggi's murder was off limits. The very topics that might justify calling this engagement were contractually prohibited from the start. So this argument doesn't just fail. It shows us exactly what they traded their principles for. And I hope they think about that bargain every time they sit on that expensive couch or visit that cute little vacation home they bought with the money. Because let's be clear about what they actually signed up for. Not engagement, but compliance. Not speaking truth to power, but entertaining power on power's terms. And second, let me digress a little here, because if comedy's job is telling truth to power, then so is philosophy's. And this is staggering hypocrisy. There is no getting around it. These are comedians who've built entire careers defending free speech. Aziz Ansari has spoken eloquently about the importance of comedy in pushing boundaries. Bill Burr has built his entire reputation on saying what others won't. Dave Chappelle walked away from millions specifically to maintain creative control. And Ansari, Chappelle, Louis C.K., Burr, they've all complained loudly and often about political correctness, censoring them in the United States. They've turned those complaints into material, into specials, into entire acts about how they can't say what they want to anymore. Except that, as we keep pointing out, they were on stage, saying it to thousands of people in sold-out venues. The censorship they railed against was criticism, not prohibition. But when faced with actual political censorship, contracts that literally forbid them discussing the government, human rights abuses, or murder, they signed. They took the money. And some of them had the audacity to downplay it. Louis C.K. even described the restrictions as minimal. Then comedian Atsuko Okatsuka bravely leaked her contract on social media and showed us exactly what minimal meant. It was a comprehensive list of prohibited topics that gutted any pretense of free expression. So let's be precise about what happened here. Comedians who claimed to be champions of free speech accepted contracts that censored them, then either stayed silent about it or misled us about the extent of the censorship. Not political correctness this time, actual political censorship. And they were fine with it, as long as the price was right. But third, and we should examine this even though I think the first 2 problems are actually already fatal, the argument assumes that engagement produces positive change. And that's an empirical claim we can test. So does it? Well, here's the real question. Exposure to whom? The Saudi public already knows what's happening in their country. They're living it. The people who need awareness are not the Saudi people, they're us, the international audience, the consumers, and the ones who might actually pressure for change. But when you perform in Riyadh under these conditions, you're not raising awareness of the problem, you're actually lowering it. You're providing evidence that everything's basically fine. Look, Aziz Ansari is there. Jimmy Carr's laughing with the crowd. Well, and he's laughing at it. You know, it is Jimmy Carr. While Pete Davidson is having a great time. But the message to us is, how bad could it be? This is what Michel Foucault spent his career documenting. Power doesn't just suppress resistance, it absorbs it, incorporates it, it reuses it. It uses that resistance to reproduce itself. When you perform for an authoritarian regime under contracts that forbid criticism, you're not subverting the system. You're demonstrating that the system can afford you. Your presence becomes the regime's proof that they're acceptable, and that even if you don't think that, you're not powerful enough or wealthy enough to stand against it. And here's the tell. If engagement was actually threatening to the regime of Saudi Arabia and its oppressive structure, they wouldn't pay millions of dollars for it. They'd ban it, like so many other things they've banned. The fact is, they're writing the checks, and they're writing the contracts that ensure you can't say anything meaningful. And that tells you everything about who benefits from this engagement. The evidence is right there, empirically, in front of us. But in Riyadh, the only awareness these comedians raised was of their asking price. The third justification is classic philosophical comfort food. I'm not political, I'm just a comedian. I just want to make people laugh. And when someone reaches for the I'm just X defense, you can hear the exhaustion in it. The implicit plea is really this. What do you expect from little old me? Do the rules of right and wrong really have to apply to me too? I'm nobody. Nobody's watching. It's just this one time. It's just this one special case. It sounds humble. It sounds like an artist trying to stay above the fray. It also sounds like special pleading. It is definitely not, as Kant would say, acting as if your maxim would become a universal law. And it's also not true on two levels. First, they are someone. These aren't open mic comics scraping by. These are some of the most successful, wealthy, influential entertainers in the world. And everyone is watching. That's literally why Saudi Arabia wanted them there in the first place, because millions of people watch what they do and where they go. And second, the good old, well, nobody's watching, so it doesn't matter defense isn't good moral reasoning. I mean, Plato literally addressed this millennia ago in his dialogues about the Ring of Gyges, where he says that if you could be invisible, if no one was watching, you should still do the right thing because it is the right thing to do. Because morally, it isn't about being caught. For Plato, and for a lot of others, it's about who you are when nobody's looking. Those are your values. But beyond that, there's no such thing as an apolitical presence, like these arguments seem to imply. Especially not in Riyadh, especially not when the regime is paying millions to get you there. These comedians' presence aren't neutral. It's a statement. As I've argued, when they perform in Saudi Arabia under these conditions, they're communicating something very specific. That the regime is normal enough, acceptable enough, and legitimate enough to host a broad range of international entertainment. That's not staying above politics, that's participating in it. It's also what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith. The act of pretending that you have no choice, or no agency, or no responsibility for your decisions. It's treating yourself as an object moved by circumstances rather than as a person making choices, and disconnected from everything that flows from it. I just want to make people laugh erases the decision to go to Riyadh specifically. It erases the decision to sign a censorship contract, and it erases the decision to accept Saudi money. But those were choices. And every choice is a statement about what you value and what you tolerate. So, if you're going to take the money, at least admit what it is buying. It buys your presence. It buys your credibility. It buys the appearance that everything's fine here and it's just another tour stop. So, comedians of Riyadh, don't pretend you were just telling jokes. You were telling the world something much more important than that. Now, I've argued before on this channel, and the existentialists would kind of agree, that we almost always have the capacity to make meaningful choices. It's just that sometimes those choices are genuinely hard. They require resisting real coercion, and they can sometimes cost us extremely dearly. But that's not what happened here. The comedians who performed in Riyadh weren't facing hardship. These are all arena-level performers who've earned tens of millions. Aziz Ansari's net worth is estimated at around 25 million US. Kevin Hart's over 60 million. Dave Chappelle's over 70 million. Some comedians who were offered the gig said no. We don't know about all of them, but we do know it happened because the festival spent years building its lineup and word leaked out. And here's what makes that choice so philosophically revealing. Because when you're that wealthy, turning down a gig costs you nothing material, really. I mean, you're not choosing between a Saudi payday and making rent. You're choosing between taking money you don't need from a regime that violates your stated values or not. No economic pressure, no career desperation, just a purely moral choice, which makes it really philosophically interesting. And that should make saying no easier. But for many of the wealthiest comedians, it didn't. And I'm fascinated by that. After all, isn't being able to say get lost to something you don't like one of the best uses of your money? I mean, maybe that says more about me. But anyway, I don't think it's because wealthy people are less moral. I mean, they're human beings like the rest of us. It's more that wealth changes how we might think about opportunity, and it's pretty insidious in that way, because when you're used to having options, turning down one feels like a loss, even when accepting it compromises what you claim to stand for. The pull isn't, I need this. When you're rich, it's more, why shouldn't I have this too? And the comedians who went to Riyadh had the most freedom to refuse and the least excuse not to. Instead, they went because they wanted to. And beneath all of the arguments about engagement and change and just making people laugh, that's what it comes down to. They wanted the money, and nothing else was quite enough to make them say no. Or, put another way, when all the practical barriers were removed, it came down to a single question. Do you want it enough to compromise the principles you claim to live by? For these comedians, the answer was yes. And no matter how sophisticated the arguments, how careful the reasoning, there's no hiding from that simple fact. I think it's pretty clear by now that, by my measure, these arguments don't work. Not logically, not empirically, and definitely not morally. So the money was kind of a moral test. And we've just examined the arguments and the justifications that came with it. The claims about engagement, change, and artistic innocence. Often, in fact, they contradict each other from one sentence to the next. Can you be both above the fray politically, just making people laugh, while also creating political change by engaging? On a sheer first-year critical thinking level, that logic doesn't work. It's more of a kitchen sink approach to defense, desperately hoping something will stick and the questions will stop. You can see it in Ansari's discomfort on Kimmel's show, the visible struggle of someone who knows what he did but wishes the question would go away. And you can see it in the silence of everyone else, the ones who don't want to talk about it at all. But there's a lot left to say, not by me, but by you. What do you think? What have I missed? Is there a better defense that I haven't considered? Let me know in the comments. I'll be in there replying. And let's turn to what I think is kind of the most important question, and the reason I wanted to do this video in the first place. It's the question of, what should we do about it? And here's what I'm not saying. Cancel them. Launch campaigns. Burn their work. That's not accountability. That's just punishment dressed up as principle. It might be cathartic, but it misses the point entirely. So let's start with something that we should recognize. Aziz Ansari went on Kimmel and faced questions. He could have ignored this completely. He could have issued a vague statement through his publicist. He could have asked Jimmy Kimmel not to bring up the subject, something which, unlike those comedians, Jimmy Kimmel is never going to agree to because no one is going to censor him through his contract. He could have done what other performers did, stayed silent and hoped that it went away while the check clears. But Aziz, he didn't do that. He showed up and he tried to explain himself. And even though I don't think his arguments work or hold up, that still matters. It still takes something to sit in that chair and answer for a choice you know people are angry about. He deserves credit for that. It's way more than, for example, Bill Burr did. In fact, I am unable to repeat his less than gracious response here on YouTube. But all I'd really like to say to him is, right back at you, buddy. It's more than Dave Chappelle did. More than any of the others who took the money and then acted like the conversation wasn't worth having. So credit where credit's due. Ansari at least tried. But here's what we can still do. We can make our own choices about what we support and what we say in response. If these performances were about the money, and they were, we don't have to fund people who contradict the values they profit from preaching. That's not cancellation. That's just refusing to be complicit in our own disappointment and saving a little bit of money along the way. Or we can simply say something, point it out, and bring it to attention. You know, the thing that they were contractually forbidden from doing in Riyadh. But not us. That too isn't cancellation. It's maintaining a standard. And that's what these comedians seem to fail to recognise every time they make a misstep and people point it out. It's not political correctness, it's criticism. And they can make their case in return. That discussion is useful, even necessary. But instead, a lot of them dismiss it with a thin-skinned term they think will magically disappear all of us who disagree with them, all of us from speaking truth to their power in return. They want the freedom to criticise without being criticised back. But I can tell you, that's not the way it works. Not in comedy, and definitely not in philosophy. So have at it in the comments, and please consider liking, hyping, and subscribing, because unfortunately, that is how it works here. And to be honest, I don't know whether Burr and co realise it, but it's also the same logic the Saudi government uses. We get to do what we want, and you don't get to question it. Our decision, your consequences. And it's a rotten logic wherever you find it. I don't think this is demanding perfection. It's asking for consistency. If you built your career on speaking truth to power, we notice when you start speaking for it instead. Look, maybe you followed this story, maybe you didn't. Maybe you think I've spent too much time on it. I objectively have. But to be honest, I wasn't sure about whether to make this video at all. I really considered not doing it and just moving on to something more culturally fun and interesting. And in the scope of what's happening in the world, a few comedians taking a payday barely registers. There are worse offences. There are more urgent injustices. And not everything needs a video response. Right, Philibot? But I kept thinking about Camus, about Sisyphus pushing that boulder up the hill, even when he knows it's just going to roll straight back down again. And about doing the work anyway. You know, not because it fixes everything, but because the work itself, I think it matters. And I realize that this is exactly the kind of moment that philosophy is for, because it's not abstract theorizing in a vacuum. It's applying our principles to real choices, to testing arguments against reality and asking whether our justifications actually hold up, or whether they're just elaborate ways of avoiding what we kind of already know. That's what I wish these comedians had done. And some of them did claim to do it, but I don't know. Not that they'd make different choices necessarily, though I think they should have, but that they'd actually engage with the weight of what they were choosing, that they'd understood and recognized what Camus understood, that when we tolerate the humiliation of one human being, we consent to the diminishment of everybody. When we participate in systems that degrade human dignity, we become complicit in that degradation. And sometimes, yes, we compromise, and sometimes we have to. But a lot of the time, and definitely in this case, we don't. We don't do it because we're monsters, but because dignity doesn't work that way. It's not individual, it's collective. And cultural complicity makes cruelty look ordinary. And that's kind of one of the worst things we can do, especially in this moment. So they could have thought about that. They could have sat with it. They could have decided that it was still worth going, maybe, but at least they would have faced what that choice meant. Instead, to be honest, we got arguments that don't hold up. We got justifications that crumble under examination. And we got a lot of very sophisticated reasoning in service of a very simple desire to take the money. And look, I understand. We all face moments where what we want conflicts with what we believe. We're tempted to construct elaborate justifications and motivated reasoning just for doing what we already decided to do. That's not unique to these comedians. That's human. I've done it too. But it's also not an excuse. It's very much a mirror. And what we see in it, that matters. In the end, the complicated part isn't the principles themselves, but living them. And they're not your values if you don't live them.
Oh, that kind of thing. Go again. I'll do as many as you like until I have pleased you.